Have you ever watched a really great film or documentary and wondered how is it possible that the other cinematographers' footage looks so much better than yours? Maybe you even have a really solid camera as well, but still when you see their films, it seems like they're doing something that you're not. And, well, that's because they are. Luckily, over the years of working with some truly world-class cinematographers, I've realized that there are a few simple tricks that the best DPs in the documentary world use to get consistently better results. This isn't about buying more expensive lenses or applying cinematic LUTs in post. It's about learning the simple yet proven tactics that top documentary cinematographers already know and how you can apply them to crush your next shoot. Okay, so play along with me for a second and let's imagine that cinematographers were gardeners. Weird analogy, I know, but hear me out. Two gardeners get hired to make a space more beautiful, but they go about it in very different ways. Now, the first gardener, they buy a huge bag of mixed seeds, they get up first thing in the morning and they spend all day scattering this huge bag in the dirt until the whole area is full. They water it, they sweep up, then they pack up their truck and head home for the day. In a few weeks, the flowers start to grow, but even though it's kind of pretty, there's no consistency, no order, no visual language, and the results are inconsistent. Maybe some sections came in great, but others are pure chaos with different colors popping up everywhere. Then we have the second gardener. The second gardener doesn't plant nearly as many seeds, but the ones that they do plant are chosen for a reason. They plant things that are well suited to the environment, they take into account where the light will fall at different times of the day, they follow the contour lines of buildings, and they leverage negative space for an effect that's, more pleasing to spend time in. A year later, the first garden looks okay, but it's more like a field of wildflowers, where the second one is like a Japanese Zen garden. Gardening and filmmaking might seem like very different pursuits, but a shocking number of cinematographers out there are just like that first gardener. They might have all the basic things they need, but there's no system, no strategy to how they work. They just hose everything down, and while they do get some amazing shots sometimes, it's not consistent. Really good DPs, on the other hand, have a go-to set of tricks in their back pockets that help them get great looking footage every time. And they're not even complicated, but by doing them well, they're not leaving anything to chance, and so in the end, their films look like the documentary equivalent of a Zen garden instead of an overgrown lot. All right, so let's ditch this weird gardening metaphor I got stuck on and get into the tips. So we're gonna start out with a really easy one here, because when I watch early career documentary DPs shoot, one thing I always notice is that they cut way too often when covering a scene. Like maybe they're following a character doing something, they find a shot they like, they grab 10 seconds of it, then they cut, and then they start looking for another shot, and then they start rolling, and so on. This can work if you're looking for just B-roll, but if you're trying to build a scene that tells a story, this is not the best approach in my opinion. In documentary shooting, cutting between every single shot is kind of more like shooting moving photos rather than building a sequence that flows. And if you're cutting like this all the time, you're probably missing out on some gold. Instead, really good doc DPs tend to roll for a lot longer and then flow with the action, moving from moment to moment fluidly, and they're always trying to make those transitions as smooth and artistic as possible. Like, it's not at all uncommon for me to roll 45-minute takes or longer as I move around a scene, and it's amazing how often I've watched a finished TV show that I've shot only to find that the editor used a ton of the in-between moments, and none of it would have existed if I just cut over and over again. Not only that, but there's also a big risk that you'll miss the first few words of an important line from your character or the start of a really interesting action that can't be repeated. If you stay rolling, you don't have that issue. Now, Hollywood might not work that way because you're shooting to a set of storyboards, but in doc, we never know what's going to happen. So shoot longer takes and don't be afraid to keep rolling if a scene is still unfolding. Make the decisions on what you want to use in post based on what works best for the story rather than being limited because you cut every 7 seconds. And while we're on the topic of better coverage, that's a classic pain point for new DPs and something that they always seem to struggle with. In Hollywood, coverage refers to getting all the different angles and shots that are needed to stitch together a sequence in the edit, and docs are no different except that we don't stop and start the action constantly. But that doesn't change the fact that an editor needs coverage to put a scene together, lots of it. And that means a wide variety of angles, perspectives, and distances, or to put it another way, wide, medium, and tight shots. Now, I've said this over and over again on this channel, and it's so important that I actually dedicated multiple lessons to how to do this well in my documentary cinematography course, which opens today for the first time in 6 months. Seamless sales pitch. The course goes deep on everything I've learned about this job over the last 15 years, including gear, lighting, professional development, and yes, scene coverage. I just added 15 brand new hands-on units to this launch, bringing the total to over 12 hours of exclusive video content spread across 75 lessons, and I go into way more detail on this stuff than I can in a single YouTube video. I've doubled the capacity to 200 spaces this time because last time it sold out in just 4 days, actually before the pre-sale even ended, but there's a really good chance it's still gonna sell out again if it hasn't already, so you might wanna jump on that. Anyways, there's a link in the description, you know how that works, but if you really wanna take your cinematography seriously this year, I made this course for you. But getting back to the DP hacks, one of the things that lets me know a DP doesn't have a ton of experience is when you look at your footage and all you see are a bunch of medium shots and hardly any wides or tights. Seriously, to cover a scene well, you need a lot of variety, and just repeating the mantra of wide, medium, and tight to yourself as you shoot will make a big difference in the quality of the edit. The details or tight shots are often the most neglected by newer DPs for some reason, I'm not sure why. So even if it might seem a little insane muttering wide, medium, and tight under your breath, if it means that you send your editor proper coverage instead of just a long series of 35mm medium shots that have to be jump cut together, it's well worth it. Now let's shift gears and get into lighting for a second, because even though in docs we don't light to the same level as Hollywood DPs, really good doc DPs still use lighting all the time. There's nothing wrong with lighting reality, but only if it doesn't look lit. As soon as the audience recognizes that the light in a scene is artificial, the illusion is broken and it just kind of looks cheap. Now let's compare two different interview frames, one bad and one good. I'll let you tell me which is which. In the first one, we've got this guy sitting in a room with this big light source on the front of his face, and sorry to pick on whoever shot this thing that I found randomly through Google, but this does not look natural to me. We'll set aside the front lighting because we're going to touch on that more later, but the real question is, where is this massive source of light coming from? It all just looks really unnatural and lit, and that's not the way pro DPs approach things. Compare that to this frame from the Netflix doc The 13th, and it's a way different story. We can see the big windows all on the side of the room, and this motivates the light source on her face so that the entire effect is much more natural, despite the fact that these are actually probably huge film lights coming through the windows and not the sun at all. And not much of this is natural if you really think about it. But which frame looks more natural? To me, it's an easy choice. The trick is to show audiences the theoretical source of your light, even if it defies the laws of physics. So like if the light looks like it's coming from something they can see or from somewhere where a light source makes sense intuitively, it feels natural. And this applies to more than just interview frames too. If you want to use lights, you should, but always ask yourself, is this source motivated? And if the answer is yes, your footage is going to get a lot better looking in a hurry. In the course, I run through a ton of different lighting setups, including how to do interviews with all kinds of different gear packages, from no gear at all to really large setups, but we also spend a ton of time looking at how to light scenes with motivated light so you can cover action that feels like the real world. Because in docs, we don't want to be scared of lights, we just want to know how to use them well and naturally, and that's why I spend so much time on it in the course. Now getting back to the first frame for a second, and again, I apologize to this DP, I don't want to hurt your feelings, but this just is not it, my friend. Apart from the light being totally unmotivated, it's also completely front lit. Now front lighting can be okay for an infomercial or really clean style where everything's supposed to be bright and even and without any shadows, but for cinematic results, our goal as a DP is to make a 2D image look 3D, and front light does not help with this. So if you want a deeper and more modeled looking frame, the simple hack is to backlight it instead, by which I mean putting the main source behind your character and not in front of it. Like if we look at this frame from the movie Moonlight, we can see backlight in action. The contrast is much better, the character pops out from the background a lot more, and the whole thing just looks three-dimensional instead of flat. Here's another frame from Shutter Island, and you can see the same thing. The main source is coming from behind, and it gives a ton of definition and dimensionality to the whole frame. Good documentary shooters use this hack all the time by figuring out where the main light source is, usually the sun, and then positioning their main character between it and the dynamic camera. Now, you won't always have that luxury because you often can't control everything on a doc shoot, but if your frame is looking flat and dull, take a second to think about where the key source is and then move around until it's coming from behind your character. I mean, take one look at the promotional poster for the documentary Retrograde and you'll see a great example of documentary backlight in action. I don't think this frame would be nearly as dramatic looking if it was shot from the reverse angle. So you don't have to backlight everything because then it's just kind of a gimmick, but more often than not, it's gonna make your shots pop and it's a great hack to have in your back pocket. There's a reason everyone does it, it just works. All right, so I'm just gonna change topics here and talk about exposure because you can use all the lights in the world, but if you expose your image badly, it's still gonna be a nightmare to work with in post. When you're out in the world shooting, by which I mean physically outdoors, there are so many variables happening minute by minute that it can be really hard to know exactly what to do when the light gets a little tricky. Because in docs, there's gonna be times when you have to shoot in bad light. It's just the nature of the beast. In a situation like that, it can be tough to know how to expose your shots so you can get the most out of it in post. And for me, there's been one guiding principle that I use most of the time whenever the light gets tricky, and it served me really well over the years. Now, I say almost all the time because there are no rules in cinematography, and there are times when I'll ignore this rule for either practical or creative reasons, but in general, if you don't know what to expose for, your best bet is usually to protect the highlights. If you don't know what I'm talking about, all you really need to know is that your camera has hard limits for what it considers pure black and what it thinks is pure white. If something is so dark that it registers on your sensor as pure black, that means there is no detail in the image and nothing you can do will bring it back. On the flip side, if something is pure white, like this light bulb probably looks, then the details have been permanently burned out or clipped and you can't drop them back down. How much latitude you have on both ends of that spectrum depends on your camera and how many stops of dynamic range it has, but why do I say protect the highlights? For starters, a lot of modern cameras are really good at recovering detail in the shadows, but less good at bringing back highlights. And aesthetically speaking, I think pure shadow is a lot more visually pleasing than blasted out highlights. That might just be a personal thing, but that's how I feel. Part of it is because burned out highlights are always the brightest part of a frame, and so the viewer's eye will just be attracted to those hotspots, so it's going to be both ugly and take their attention away from the real subject. If the point is to draw attention to the bright light itself, or if you're shooting indoors with a lot of windows around, this doesn't apply as much because it's really common to let the windows blow out in the background of indoor scenes. Pro DPs can get around that in different ways, either by adding diffusion to the windows or lights to the interior, but if you're not up for any of that, then you'll have no choice but to let them blow out. But I digress. On top of all that, the current trends in the industry are also leaning heavily towards darker looking footage these days, and a lot of color grades are actually trying to bring down the overall levels, so why not lean into that and save your highlights at the same time? Now, obviously the best option is a nicely balanced image where you can get detail in everything, and a great DP will be really good at finding frames where things don't blow out or get crushed into darkness, but as a quick strategy to keep in your back pocket when shooting outdoors, when in doubt, protect the highlights. All right, let's wind up with the simplest tip of all, a practice that every doc DP can do to get better footage that costs almost nothing and requires very little effort, and it's all about audio. And I know it might sound weird to say that you can hurt your footage with bad sound, but as you've probably heard before, in film, the audio is almost or even more important than the picture. Audiences will sit through terrible picture quality if the sound is good, like think of the Blair Witch Project, but if the sound is terrible, it will distract from everything. Like think about how mad people were about the movie Tenet being hard to hear. It can easily distract from the audience experience. So to make your footage hit its true potential, it needs to be paired with clean sound, and that means you need to know what you're capturing on location. If a lav mic is falling off your subject's chest and it's hanging down at their belt for 4 hours, you need to know that. Or if there's radio interference from local airways, you need to hear those clicks and pops and find a new frequency. And that means you need to monitor everything. Another reason monitoring matters so much is that it can actually help you decide what to focus on. It's amazing how much we learn about a person when they're mic'd up all day and you're listening into everything they say, regardless of whether or not you're in the same conversation as them or even in the same room. When you have a wireless feed of your character, you can learn all sorts of stuff, like if they're getting annoyed with you, or maybe how they feel about a situation by hearing them talk about it to someone else, or even just mumbling to themselves. And the more you know about your character, the more you know what to shoot and what's most relevant to your story, so it's really a win-win. Thankfully, all you have to do is wear headphones. So this is one of the easiest high impact hacks you can implement. They don't need to be anything fancy, and most times even a set of $9.99 Walmart headphones will work, but they're the most effective way to protect your sound as a DP. There aren't really any downsides to wearing headphones apart from the fact that it's sort of annoying to be tethered to your camera. I'm sure one day Bluetooth is going to be so good that I can just monitor my camera with a set of AirPods, but for now we'll just have to deal with the cables because it really will make a massive difference in the quality of your coverage. So there we go, 6 hacks every doc cinematographer needs in their arsenal if they want to get the most out of their footage. And if you like this video and you're as into this stuff as I am, check out the link in the description to find out more about my documentary cinematography course, and maybe I'll see you in the members group. See ya.